So, thanks for being here. This is really awesome. Having so many people, seeing people I've met over the years. It's great to be back, and it's great to see everybody again. It's really nice. Also, thanks for special shout out to everybody from down under New Zealand. My mom lives there, so I have a special. She's actually from there, so I've got a special. That's where part of my roots are. All right. Thanks. I didn't even tell her about it, so maybe my wife did. I told my wife, so no, anyway. Cool. Very good, but enough of that. Welcome to Getting Your Hands Dirty Testing Magento 2. Me, web developer most of my life. My wife actually said I should put the slide here just in case somebody doesn't know me. I don't know. Whatever. Let's move on. So I want to talk about testing tonight, right? And this talk's supposed to be like 45 minutes, which is longer than what I'm used to. Normally, it's like a conference slot. It's like 25 minutes plus, and that might include Q&A. I'll try my best to fill that time without boring you. This talk is going to be technical, so my apologies for the non-developers about you. Nothing I can do about it. You can do work. I don't feel offended if you do that. All right. So what I want to talk about this testing is not the kind of testing, opening a web page in a browser or in multiple browsers and trying to break forms by entering weird characters. And that's very important testing, this kind of manual testing that testers do. What I want to talk about is the type of testing where we have self-testing code. Basically, we run a command or maybe a series of commands, and afterwards we know the code pretty much does what it's supposed to do. That kind of testing. And first of all, I always like to do a little poll just because I'm curious. Who's actually writing that kind of code, self-testing code? Please give me some hands here, and I'll try to say, oh, OK, that's 5, 6, really? Come on, give me some hands. All right, oh, OK. Who has written a test before? OK, much better, like 90%. No, anyway, OK.
Don't want to pay for it.
Sorry?
Clients don't want to pay for it.
Oh, good point. But if there's time, we'll get to that later on. So those of you who are using it, congratulations. I would be curious to see which tools you are using, because there's so many tools out there with in PHP land only, right? So who's using PHP unit to write tests? All right. OK, that's of those who set up, it's about half, I'd say. So who's using Behat and or PHP spec? OK, about a quarter of those. Who's using Selenium for functional testing? OK, that's a lot more like an and, not an or necessarily here, right? OK, very good. So who's using Codeception? 1. All right, so it's present. Who's using something else? All right, please come by later and let me know what it is. I'm always curious to hear what people are using. There are so many tools out there. Yeah, there's a lot there. Anyway, different topic. So when I'm talking about testing, I have to talk about some of those words that are very common in the testing domain. But for me, getting into testing, I felt a little intimidated by them because I didn't realize what's the difference? Why does it matter? But those words make a difference because it helps. When I say those words, then at least I would like you to understand what I'm trying to talk about. So when I introduce those words, I'll try to give a rough introduction, what I think they mean. It's not necessarily what other people think they mean. It's just what I think they mean. So buzzword 1 would be a unit test. And a unit test, well, it tests a unit, obviously. So what is a unit? Any idea? I'll repeat for the recording. Just what do you think? What's a unit? A method? Who said that? OK, a method. Very good. Any other ideas? What's a unit?
Class.
A class? Right, so opinions start to differ already, right? And it could be a method, it could be, but we don't really know. So for me, a unit test means it could be usually a class. So it's like one public method with a bunch of private methods behind it, possibly. Or maybe even including a separate classes that are extracted out of the first class. It's still a unit test, right? And I consider that one unit of code. So it's really not a black or white thing. What is a unit test? What isn't? It's a bit of a matter of, different people have different opinions. So that's a unit test. And Magento 2 comes with a ton of them. So a couple of thousand actually. And what's even more important, or just as important, is if you have Magento 2 installed and ready, you also have the means installed and ready to run those tests. So by the way, who's got Magento 2 installed somewhere? Oh, okay, great. About 3/4 or so. Cool. So to execute those unit tests, right, you can run them in different ways. This is one way how you can execute them, right? You run render bin php unit -c for configuration file, and then dev test unit, and this is the default configuration file, and it will run all these tests. It'll take, depending on your machine and your PHP version, a couple of minutes to something like that, and afterwards you'll know everything's all right, or not, right? So that's kind of useful. Because that's kind of a mouthful to write always, and it always depends on where you're in the file system, what your current working directory is. You can also use, you can alias that to a little bash alias to run it. So prefixing it with, well, I can't really use a laser pointer on the screen, I guess. So prefixing that with w present working directory command is one way to be able to execute them without always having to have a shell open in the root directory. I don't know, it just makes it a bit more comfortable. A lot of people put that into their bash profile, and then they just can run it easily. And you can still add additional arguments, like if you only want to run some tests, you can just specify the directory, and you will only execute those tests below that directory. So what I'm trying to say here is it's actually pretty simple to run the tests included in Magento 2, which is a big improvement over Magento 1, where I found quite a lot of people already struggled just getting PHP unit running, right? So it's all pretty much ready to go. So let's try that, right? So let's execute some tests and run, let's say here, the module catalog, right? That's our catalog module. It's probably the largest module in Magento 2, or Magento 1 for that means. And let's just run the unit block test just to see how that looks like. Because, my purpose, why I'm giving this talk, is because I want to motivate people and get people into using that stuff. And sometimes the first step is the hardest, even if it's a simple one, right? So I want to show you how easy it is to do it. So here's a shell. This is just a basic Magento 2 installation. Use Composer to install it. So to execute the test here, let me just see. So I'm using PHP 5.6, right? And vendor bin php unit, and a -c for configuration file, dev tests unit php unit xml dist. So that's the configuration file, and I want to tell it which test to execute. So that would be in vendor Magento module catalog. Oops, module catalog tests unit. So this directory structure is the same for any module within Magento. The unit tests are always part of the module. And now within catalog, I want to run the block tests, right? And we can see, it starts, it parses them, 161 tests. It tells us how many it already executed. All's good, right? So let's try the whole thing with PHP 7, right? So if I set the PHP version to 7, rerun the same tests, let's see. Oh, look at that. Huh, something isn't quite right. Right, okay, and it tells me exactly which one's, not quite ready. So I don't know, I haven't dug into what exactly isn't failing here, but right now I'd say, well, I want to double check before I actually use Magento 2 on PHP 7 at this time, right? Generally it's supposed to be okay, but right now this release, I hold off for a little while maybe. All right, so you can see how useful it is to have that kind of tests. Having to go into Magento, manually test if it works with a given PHP release, or you have to retest that for every new version of Magento or PHP, stuff happens. And this is an easy way to quickly fix that kind of bugs, or catch that kind of bugs. So it's quick feedback loop, that's what it's about. So it's useful. All right, so those were unit tests. Now the next kind of tests that I want to talk about, there are many different kinds of tests, but the next kind of test I want to talk about are integration tests. What is an integration test? What's the difference to a unit test? Piece of functionality. Okay, yeah, good. Any other ideas or definitions? And again, this is not hard science, right? This is more like, what do you think it means? Yeah?
It can talk to real versions of other components.
Real versions of software. Right. So what it means is real objects interact. So with a unit test, I'm just having this one unit. I kind of know I didn't make a mistake while coding it, and it works with the next PHP version. But what it doesn't tell me is if two of those units, do they actually fit together, right? Or will it just not work? That's what the integration tests are there for. So I get real units and real classes and make them work together and see if they actually do, if one gives the input for the other one as it's supposed to, and the other one understands what it's receiving. So that's what integration tests are. With a unit test, I would replace all those other classes with test doubles, like stand-in placeholders. So integration tests need the runtime environment. For Magento, what is the runtime environment? It's the file system, right? It needs the autoloader, it needs all those other classes, it needs the right directory structure, it needs all the configuration files, it needs the cache, all of that. It also needs the database. It needs to connect to the database to reach the configuration values, maybe load some other data. So this whole setup is going on, which is not doing it with unit tests. There it's just the PHP code with no external requirements. And that means that for a unit test, if that fails, it tells me exactly where my code is broken. Where do I have to go to fix it or to find out what's going wrong? With the integration test, I pretty much only know something's broken. But to figure out what is wrong, additional debugging is required. I will have to go in and start digging. And how long, you never know how long debugging takes, right? Could be 5 minutes, could be a day or more, whatever, depending on what it is. But it's pretty good to know that something is broken, right? I'd rather know something is broken than know nothing. So integration tests and unit tests, what I'm trying to say here is that they provide value at a different level, but both are really important and both basically saved my butt a ton of times. So it's not like you can do one and leave out the other. If you're trying to run a solid testing strategy, both makes a lot of sense. The integration tests in Magento 2, they use a separate database. And when trying to run the integration tests in Magento 2, we have to provide that. So there's a file in dev test integration etc install config mysql.php.dist. We are supposed to copy that into the same directory without the dist suffix, and there we put the credentials for our database, testing database. And it's a good idea to use a separate database because Magento will be reinstalled into that database every time we run the integration tests. So it would completely mess up our production system if we tried to use that, right? So separate database. It just has to be a database. We don't have to manually install it. It takes care of that, but it has to be a separate database. Good. Now, if we try to run the integration tests the same way we ran the unit tests, so this is pretty much like the previous command line, right? Vendor bin PHP unit and the configuration file. Only this time it's dev test integration PHP unit. It doesn't work, right? It says could not read dev test integration PHP unit.xml. So that file exists. It's not a permissions issue. There are many issues around permissions with Magento 2, but that's not the case this time. Instead, what's happening is it's actually expecting us to execute the integration tests within the directory dev test integration. And if PHP unit is executed within a directory and that directory already contains a PHP unit configuration file, it will automatically pick it up. So once we move into that directory, we can just run PHP unit and then it works, right? Just saying, because at first I was like, why doesn't it work? I can read the file, it should be working, but it's executing sub-processes which run from a different directory, so it can't find the PHP unit file, if I just specify that as a command line argument. All right. Okay, I think I have to speak a bit slower here. I feel a bit breathless. So when running the integration tests, they get their own runtime environment, not only in the database, but also in the file system. So they get their own etc pub and var directory, and that gets generated within this temp directory. It's sandbox and then some kind of long hash. And if I want to see, let's say, what configuration files look like that are used during the test, or what is there a log file or something like that. I don't have to look into the real var directory. I have to look into the var directory within this place. And right, so just saying, remember this directory, might save you time again. So it's actually pretty easy to execute it, but you can already see or get a feel for maybe the integration tests are more involved, right? It's not just PHP code as a unit. You have more moving parts. And the Magento 2 integration test framework is trying to make it as easy as possible to run them. But there are more parts. Just we have to be aware of them, and then it's not a big deal. Okay. So when talking about testing, it's always good to talk about TDD. A lot of people kind of think they're synonyms, TDD and self-testing code. So who knows what TDD means? What does it mean? Test-driven development. Any other ideas? Test-driven design, something like that. Something test-driven, right. Okay, so test-driven development is the idea that during every step of development, I would first write a test before I write the actual code. So I like to think about testing. There are these 3 rules of TDD as defined by, I don't know, probably Kent Beck actually. Might have been Robert C. Martin, Uncle Bob, who kind of summarized it that way. But the first rule is, I'm not allowed to write any production code without a failing unit test first. Which means I first have to write a unit test, and as soon as that fails, I have to stop writing the unit test. That's the second rule. As soon as my test fails, I stop writing the unit test, and I have to make it pass by writing production code. Right? And then the third rule is, once that test passes, I have to stop writing the production code and go back to continue writing a new unit test or expanding the current unit test until I have a failing unit test again. And if I follow this, it locks me into a cycle of, I don't know, somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes writing test, writing production code, writing test code, writing production code. And that way, I always have a pretty quick feedback loop that what I'm writing actually works. And it also forces me to write my code in a way that I can easily run it through the test, which generally has some advantages. Some people disagree there. I find it kind of helpful, but that's the idea of TDD. And TDD is being used by the Magento core team for many of the features. But doing TDD for Magento 2, there's no difference from doing TDD for anything else. To be honest, even doing TDD for Magento 1, it's pretty much the same thing. Or for Symfony or Drupal or anything else. It doesn't matter, right? Because TDD works mainly with unit tests, and unit tests just test my code. So I don't care what platform it is, I can do my TDD. But because there's no difference, I really don't want to talk about TDD anymore tonight. If you're interested to learn more about TDD, there's a great video series of Clean Coders that's from Uncle Bob or Robert C. Martin at cleancoders.com, or you can do a training. There are many different companies, including myself, offering training, so that's my ad block here, right? Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a bit like gamifying development. I like it a lot. I find it very helpful, but I won't talk about that because I want to talk about something that's specific for Magento 2, and that will be integration tests. How can I write integration tests? So to create integration tests, they're very specific for the platform I'm writing them on, right? It requires platform knowledge. So that's why I chose, okay, I want to talk about that. I would love to talk more about TDD too, but that's a different topic. Magento 2 provides a testing framework. We can see it under Dev Test Integration Framework. It's not that big. You can easily see it, but it provides a lot of the things that make my life as a developer a lot easier to work with it. So I'll go over some of the features this testing framework offers. So my hope here is that you might be motivated to try them out. Or maybe if you see them in the code when you're starting to dig into Magento 2, you'll recognize them and just be able to use them and read them. So the first thing is, in every single integration test that I've written so far, I needed the object manager. Right? So what's the object manager's purpose in Magento 2? Yeah. Create create new instances of classes. That's right. That's the whole sort of purpose of the object manager. And actually, not only that, another thing it does is it manages the dependencies for the object it needs to create. So it can create object hierarchies or object graphs. So normally in integration tests, I want to have real objects interacting, so I need to instantiate them, right? And that's what the object manager does. And you can easily get a copy, an instance of the object manager using this static method, and then you can use it to create your classes. So to create one of those classes, you can simply call object manager create with a class name, and it'll give you the class. If this class has any kind of dependencies, they will automatically be created and passed in. We don't have to worry about it at all. However, if we want to, we can specify some of those dependencies manually. So here, for example, there's another class, a deployment config instance, whatever that is, and we can say, okay, if this deployment config, if that takes a reader as a dependency in its constructor, please, object manager, use this instance here. So that way I can instantiate my classes and compose them together as necessary using this kind of dependency injection, and any additional requirements will be still handled automatically. So that way I can put my system into a state that exactly executes the code I wanted to execute. So that's the object manager. And another very important part the testing framework does is fixtures. So what's a fixture? A fixture fixes the system into a known state before the test is executed. That's important because if I don't know what state my system is in, the test might fail. But yesterday it worked and I didn't change anything. So to avoid that kind of flaky tests, I always want to have a known state it executes in, and that's what a fixture does. So what could be a fixture? A fixture could be, I want an order by a guest with a pending payment in a pending status. And the guest should be from, I don't know, Germany or wherever, right? So a very specific set of circumstances, and would be one example for a fixture. Now, most fixtures in Magento 2 in the testing framework are simple PHP scripts. And they are specified with a file system path relative to this directory here, so the test suite directory. And to specify them, we can use the special annotation that the testing framework provides, which is Magento data fixture. And then we can specify the path name to the fixture file, and it will simply include those files before it runs a test. Very simple. So for example, here we're creating an order and we're creating a customer. So now we can run a test that uses an order and a customer. And it's pretty simple. Yeah. Another type of fixture are configuration fixtures. So any Magento developer knows in Magento 1, Mage get store config, right? So that's this kind of fixture configuration settings. And we can easily provide those using the Magento config fixture annotation. And normally we want to specify those within a certain scope. So the annotation syntax is first we have the store scope, the store to apply it in, and then the path, and then the value. Now, the store path, there's a special store code which is current store, which is just the current store, which is mostly what I want, because I don't want my tests usually to depend on a certain configuration. Like I want this, UK store and the French store. Normally I want the more generic. Well, maybe I don't, and then I can use real stores, but current store is usually what I want to use. But if I do want to use maybe a UK store, so my store code would be UK, I have to write it as UK_store. So this underscore store is actually being matched by the regular expression in the code using this, applying this annotation. It took me just a little, an hour or so to, why is it using my fixture? Oh, I have to put underscore store behind the store code. So just saying, all right. So that's just like the marker for I've got a store here. Otherwise, it assumes that actually is part of the path. Okay, then we can also specify global scope config fixtures here by simply omitting the store, and then it's like a global config fixture. So it's easy to do to create this kind of fixture, and that's a very common task when writing integration tests. So next important factor about unit tests, or any tests actually, but it's more of an issue in regards to testing with integration tests. is test isolation. So test isolation means if I run my tests, it shouldn't matter in which order they run, or if I run all of them or only a subset or only a single one. Right? It should always be, each test should run in isolation. Meaning if one test creates a bunch of orders or deletes a bunch of orders, the next test shouldn't fail because it expects one of those orders to exist. They should be independent. Right? That's test isolation. Magento tries to assist us by, so the test framework does so, by every time I run the integration tests, it will reinstall Magento into the test database. Right? So any prior stuff doesn't matter. It's like a fresh, clean slate, fresh Magento installation. That's kind of nice. But we can tune this behavior in the PHPUnit XML configuration file. There's a bunch of settings, and this is probably the one I changed the most. It's the test cleanup constant setting. And by default, it's enabled. So this means on every test run, reinstall Magento and also regenerate this whole sandbox directory. So it copies all the files from app.etc into there. It rebuilds the whole cache. It regenerates all the code generation, and all that's redone. But of course, that takes a long time. About, I don't know, on my machine, it's about 30-second overhead. So while I'm writing a test, and I write a line to see if it works, fix something, see if it works, still doesn't work, and every time I have to wait 30 seconds, that's a lot of wasted time. So I tend to disable that. And then it's only like a 6-second overhead for each test. So it's much more pleasant to run them. But, of course, if I run a full integration test suite, I want that enabled, right? So on continuous integration, I want that enabled. So it's important to realize, am I running with test isolation enabled or disabled? Right. But for me, finding out I can disable it was great because I was really annoyed by having to wait. And I want to test, but it makes it so hard trying to wait all the time. All right. So disabling that speeds things up, but manual cleanup is required, which mainly means just removing dev tests, integration temp sandbox, and then rerunning it. The database cleanup isn't usually that much of an issue because database isolation. That means, well, by default, it doesn't actually use database isolation, but we can easily enable database isolation. So let's say I'm deleting quotes in a test. Maybe I'm writing some kind of script that cleans up the quote table, like, I don't know, in Magento 1. Maybe other tests still require that. So there are two ways I can isolate the test from the others: transaction or rollback scripts. This is how it works. To enable transactions, I simply have to specify Magento DB isolation enabled. And now it will open a transaction, run the test, and roll back the transaction after the test. So we're good, right? So normally, every time I have some kind of database involvement in my tests, I just enable the test isolations. Good idea. Another time that the isolations are enabled is if I specify a data fixture. This automatically turns on test isolation, database isolation. So after the test runs, it will roll it back and the fixture will be removed again. So that's actually the common case. So just saying. So normally the stuff will be rolled back fine. However, if my test involves some kind of testing that transaction actually works, right? Maybe I want to test an error condition that it successfully rolls back a transaction. Then I can't really use test isolation with a transaction. So for that case, I can specify Magento DB isolation disabled with a fixture. And in that case, it uses rollback scripts. So all the core fixture files that are included before the test, for example, this one that creates a customer, come with a second version of it, which is _rollback.php. So based on the file name, if transactions are not used, it will automatically try to run this file and include it after the test. And then the fixture will be reverted again. However, if I created additional entries in my test, I would have to clean that up manually, right? All right, so that's database isolation in the Magento integration test framework, which is actually pretty nice. It works quite well. But we're still not done with the topic of isolation. Sorry. We also have the application isolation. What does that mean? So application isolation would be if I've maybe created some shared instances, which is the Magento 2 pendant of the Magento 1 singletons, right? Magento 1 singleton weren't singletons. They're just in the registry. In Magento 2, we have something similar. They're just basically an array within the object manager. They're called shared instances. And of course, if I create them, if I don't clean them up, they persist between the tests, so they might influence the next test. And that's why Magento allows us to reinstantiate almost everything after a test by using the Magento app isolation enabled call. In that case, it will rerun the test. Actually, it does that automatically even between each test suite. So if I have a class that contains a bunch of classes, after it's finished with a class, it basically reinitializes Magento. But it will also do that for each test if I enable application in isolation. So I don't manually have to check which shared instances I'm using. I can just turn on application isolation. Then again, I think they didn't turn it on automatically for everything because once again, it's more overhead. It has to, a couple of instances like the database connection persist, but many others have to be reinitialized and reread and so on. All right, there's one exception here, which are controller tests, which are reinitialized automatically. So any test case that extends from test case abstract controller, because usually what we do in a controller test is we dispatch a request. So that would mean maybe some layout XML is loaded and generated, some output is put into the response object and so on. So a whole bunch of state is created, and that's great for the test. But I can't run the next test that does the same thing again, right? So that's why by default this always will enable the application isolation. So what I'm trying to say here is basically isolate your tests and all will be good, right? Otherwise we get this weird little bugs where sometimes tests work, sometimes it doesn't, and they're really hard to debug because it's dependent on the platform and the version and just something to watch out for. And it's easy to miss in the beginning. For me. Okay, good. Right. So we're moving quite good. I hope you're still okay and with me. And yes, people look kind of awake. Good. Cool. All right. All right. So Magento has application areas, meaning front end and admin HTML mostly, and global by default. We had the same thing in Magento 1. What's new? Now we can specify the area in which the test is executed. What's my current area? And that can be quite different because more in Magento 2 than in Magento 1. We can create configuration that is actually specific for one area. I can say this kind of like rewrite should only happen in the admin area, or for plugins, for preferences, for pretty much anything, observers, routes. So very often it's important which area is being used, and we can easily do that with this Magento app area annotation. And we can use it with front-end, global, or admin HTML. The default, so if I don't specify an app area, it defaults to global anyway, right? So, okay. But there are more areas. That's new in Magento 2, the web API areas, REST and SOAP. Cron, we also had that in Magento 1, but it was barely used, or most people didn't have to interact with it. So, however, web API REST and SOAP is quite important. So one of my first experiences with Magento 2 was I was trying to build an observer or a plugin for when a customer places an order. Quite common thing. Okay, I want to do something. And I did it for the front-end scope because I thought, front-end, customer, placing an order. Nope, didn't work. Why? Because when I click place order after the checkout, it's actually a REST request, AJAX request. So the area is web API REST. So just saying, it's good to know which areas we're using. However, it's not possible to use these areas with the Magento app area annotation, because this area automatically loads the design config for some reason, and these don't use like a design config. It doesn't really make sense here. So trying to use those just throws an exception. So we have to do that manually in the code, right? We can always do that, and that's where this class comes in, test framework app state. So if we create an instance of that using our object manager, we can just set the current area code, and then it works for every kind of instance. And if we do so, this will persist unless we turn on application isolation. And we can reset that in a teardown method, right? Easily, just like so. All right. Now, almost done with the overview of some of the features that I find the most useful in the integration test framework. Action tests. Now, Magento 2 has actions. They're not always called controllers anymore, right? So now they're only actions. So that's why I put this weird controller there in the middle. So there are two different abstract classes, abstract controller and abstract backend controller. And they can be used, like if I want to write a test that tests such a controller, I want to extend one of these classes. And then I just have to call dispatch, and it will automatically take care of authentication or the secure admin key and all that stuff. So it's much easier to test my code, actually. OK. Right, so that was enough of the theory. I wanted to show you a quick example here. It's code. I decided against doing live coding because I didn't know how that would work from a timing perspective. But the idea that I wanted to work through, just show some sample code, was an event observer for the sales order place after event. We also have that event in Magento 1, so probably seems familiar to all the Magento 1 developers here, the backend developers, that is. And every time I'm testing something in Magento 2, there are usually several layers to test. Like Magento 1 or 2 uses a lot of configurations, so my first thing that I could test there would be the configuration. Right? And I could even write the test first, and once the test passes, I know my configuration's OK. So here's an example. First, I need the class that reads the configuration. For observers, that happens to be the class framework event config. And then I can get a list of the configured observers using the getObservers method with the observer code. Right? So the tricky part is actually only figuring out which class to use here. Once I've got the right class, OK, it usually has a method that gives me exactly what I want. And then I can do any kind of assertions that check, is it the right class? Is it a shared instance or not? Does it even exist or not? So I can easily test my code there. So what's the benefit? Or why would I even want to test configuration XML with PHP unit? Is it a waste of time, is what I'm asking, or not?
It's not a waste of time.
Everybody's like, yeah. no, sorry, what are you saying?
It's not, at least half the time I change the configuration and reload the page, it hasn't worked.
OK, so just for the stream. So at least half the time I change the configuration, I reload the page, it doesn't work. Yeah, that's true. And running the test is normally a bit quicker than reloading the browser. So yeah, that can be useful, but OK. Anything else? So when would this test break? As long, if I'm not changing the configuration. What kind of bugs would this catch? Magento probably won't change the config XML syntax. At least I don't expect them to do. Actually, it's pretty OK, the syntax. So why could that break? So the reason is I find that is useful because the same reason as in Magento 1, module conflicts. So in Magento 1, it was a lot more likely. In Magento 2, they're a lot less likely to happen. But this observer name here, right? We also had observer names in Magento 1. And guess when two people start using the same observer name? That is, when I take one version of a file, copy it, and adjust, and forget to adjust the observer name. I've seen that happen, right? So this would actually catch that kind of bug. So it's good to keep people from making stupid mistakes like I do all the time. So I catch my own bugs here. And yeah, so I found that actually to be useful, especially because writing this test is cheap too. So yeah, why not do it? If it catches one bug like that, great. It saved me time. All right. So, oh yeah, I actually split all that code into different slides to talk about it, but I already did that. So let's move on. The second thing to test after I did my configuration part is the actual PHP code, that is the observer, right? So there would be unit tests. And usually I would go ahead and do TDD or not, but I still could write some kind of unit test that just tests my PHP code. So unfortunately, I cannot give you an example here because I don't have a use case here. I just said create an observer. It doesn't do anything, so there's nothing I can test. I would need something like, oh, it has to write to a log file, or it has to call an API. Yeah, that's something we could test. So I didn't want to come up with an example that kind of makes sense here. So that's just unit tests. So let's move on. There's one more thing we can do, which is the integration test part. So how do I integration test the actual observer, which does not only test the configuration. And since our observer has no side effects, since it doesn't do anything, right? It's just an observer for an event that doesn't do anything. We'll have to improvise a bit. So what I want to do is this test here. So all it does, it is test that the sales order placed after observer, that our observer is actually called when an order is placed. So here we have a test, and it uses an order fixture with using the annotation. And first of all, it injects the mock observer with the expectation. We'll look at what's beyond this method in a moment. That's the next slide. Then we get the order fixture, so whatever order was created here, and then the order gets placed. So if that actually triggers my observer, I'm good. So first of all, this is how to create a mock, a test double. PHP unit can do that on the fly. It's a lot of fun doing it. It's easy to overdo it, but okay. So here, this is the important line. So we say the test will only succeed if the method execute is called once during the time the test is executing. So if the execute method is not called, the test will fail. So that's actually my assertion. Only with PHP unit it's a little weird. We say before we actually do it, we say, oh, but this has to be done when I actually call the actual place method. All right, time to move out, I guess. Just or the vacuum cleaner. Anyway, so then the next part is registering the observer test double, and I think this is probably the most interesting slide of this example, because writing integration tests for Magento 2 oftentimes look like this. We mess with the configuration XML. So here, it's creating an instance of this config data class that happens to be the class that provides the event dispatcher with which events to dispatch, to which observers to dispatch to. So here, we're getting an instance of this class, and then we can call merge, passing in an array for our event with our event name. We're setting shared to true, as if in the configuration file the shared property was set to true. So now it's kind of like a singleton observer, right? So what we're doing is on the fly, we're just modifying the configuration a little bit so we can inject our test double in this case. And then if we look at the second part of this method here, we call object manager add shared instance, which is a method that is only provided by the integration test object manager. And we say, okay, every time somebody tries to retrieve an instance of this class, please return this test here, this test double. Right, and now, when the observer is placed, the object manager knows, oh, it's a shared instance, and oh, I already have one of those instances available, so I'll just return that. And then hopefully the execute method will call of it if everything else works correctly. So what's left is getting the order from the order fixture. And this is actually different from Magento 1. It's just part of the new Magento 2 framework here. It's not really test relevant. It's basically now, instead of just loading it through a collection or mage get model sales order load, we would use a repository with a search criteria and retrieve it that way. So that's just Magento 2 specific. It's not really test specific. But now we have the order here, and now we can create the object or get the object manager instance to create an order management instance and call place, which is exactly what happens if I click place in the admin or on the front end or through the REST API or any other way, right? And if everything works correctly, the observer will be executed. So that's just one example of how to write the test. It's a little weird looking at the code in the slide, right? It's actually not too bad in reality, so apologies for this. But it was just one example I could come up to. Okay, so yeah, have fun testing, basically. There's one more thing I just want to point out, and that is I've decided to do a project for 2016, which is Mage2 Katas. It's a YouTube channel. You can get there using mage2katas.com. And who's familiar with the idea of code katas? Okay, very good. Some are. So the idea is here to practice common tasks, kind of like it's borrowed from martial arts, where the students practice the same movements, a million times, and then when somebody gets into a real fight, they don't have to think about the actual movements. The body has learned how to do them, so that happens automatically. He can really pay attention to, I don't know, what the opponent is doing, something useful. So the same idea is here for coding, testing, or any kind of problem. we can focus on the actual problem without having to worry about, oh, how do I create a mock? How do I put it into, the registry or wherever? That's all taken care of, and my brain knows how to do that, so it just kind of happens. So the idea here is we have a bunch of screencasts, and they're examples of common tasks during Magento 2 development. And so you can use them as code katas, and I try to bring a new video out every 2 weeks, so that's like why my goal is here to, just bring people to discover the joy of testing, right? Because it really is. It's great. Once you get into it, it feels like before I started working with source code control systems, like in the beginning CVS, then there was SCM, then there's a Git, right? So after I started using those systems, I couldn't imagine going back again working without them. And it's the same thing with testing. Once I started testing and really learned the basics, I can't imagine working without it anymore. And it feels so dangerous. It feels like, oh, I hope I don't hit anything, or I don't trip, I don't know, I can't see where I'm going. And it really helps. So I hope you, look at it. They're between 10 and 15 minutes, or going to be between 10 and 15 minutes. At the moment, they're only the first 2 episodes. This Friday, I'll be posting the next one, I hope. So anyway, check it out if you want to. Thank you for listening. I don't know if we've got time for questions. I hope so. Let's hear.
I just had one question, which is how much would you rely on Magento 2's framework? How much would you build on it? Do you expect it to change much? So if you build on top of it?
The testing framework or the framework itself?
The testing framework. What Magento 2 is providing.
Okay. So the testing framework, yes, of course, I would definitely build on it. It seems very stable. So that's the thing. For the testing framework that they built, they had to eat their own dog food, right? Because they were writing a lot of tests using it. That's a bit different from, I don't know if they actually were building stores using their, but the testing framework, that's pretty solid. So yeah. Yeah, developers themselves always have the best tools. Look at Git, right? So much better than what we give the business owners. So yeah. Okay, any other questions? Everybody's fallen asleep. Okay, no.
So at the beginning you talk about Selenium. And
Right. So at the beginning we're talking about Selenium, just repeating for the stream. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm using Casper
Mhm.
JS, and whenever I try, I see like the market are going through Selenium, but when I saw that in a low budget, I saw, oh, I have to install a server, I have more money to go that road, and then I went to Casper because it's kind of easier.
Yeah, totally.
I'm wrong. Is it easier in Selenium way? Is it cheap?
Well, okay, so the question was, you're using Casper because it's easier to run that. With Selenium, you have to run the Selenium server. It's more overhead, it's more complicated. Maybe you have to buy the service from something like a browser, a Source Labs or something, right? So you can run Selenium easily on your local instance, just like Casper, if you know how to start the server. So that's basically a DevOps questions. Do you have the skill set in-house to do that? Then it's not a big deal. If you don't, and you're more of a front-end guy who knows how to run Casper JS, then that's easier. It doesn't really matter if you use Selenium or if you use Casper. I like Casper. It's good. That would be my take on that. It doesn't matter what tool you use as much as that you're testing, and that you're writing tests that are valuable. So yeah. So regarding front-end testing in general, I don't do it very much, like that kind of Selenium or Casper. I like to have some, but only the most important stories. And my main reason for that is that it's very slow to run them, so it isn't such a quick feedback cycle. And also it's pretty expensive to write and maintain those tests compared to how quick and easy it is to write a unit test. So given the benefit and the costs, I tend to write just the most essential ones on that level of testing. Yeah. Does that kind of answer what you were after? Okay, good. Oh, over there.
Could you speak about mocking non-injectables?
Okay, so the question was, could I speak about mocking non-injectables? So what's a non-injectable? I think I know what you mean, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, so for example, when you have a product,
Okay.
you have the product has properties, so you can't just normally inject it into the constructor.
Right. Okay.
You have this, they all share this instance for shared objects, but something.
Okay. So the idea is that a some classes can be injected in the constructors and some shouldn't. Technically you can, but there are reasons why not. And for the example there was a product, because the product usually every class I want to inject through the constructor should be fully instantiated and prepared. So it doesn't require additional work to use it. Now a product, if it's a fresh instance, it's like an empty product. It's not a real product at all. I have to load it, or I have to set data on it before it's ready to be used. So that's like a non-injectable. So the reason what to inject instead would be either a product repository if you want to load it, or a product factory if you want to create a new instance. So if you want to mock those classes, you would usually inject the repository or the factory, and then that's your mock. And object instantiation always is kind of messy, right? I usually really dislike creating a mock that returns a mock. But in those cases, like a factory, yeah, that's what a factory does, right? So I'll have a mock, and when a create is called on the mock, then it returns load or get or whatever on the repository, then that will return the actual mock that I want to work with the product. Does that kind of answer where you're going? Yeah. So in those cases, I create a mock that returns a mock, yeah. Ugly, but I don't know a better way. Okay. All right. You had a question, right?
Yeah, it wasn't about the testing.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, we can do that later. Okay, everybody's bored with testing. Cool. No, I hope you like it. So I think we're good. Thank you very much. Yeah, come by and ask questions later if you want to.